You're listening to Blue Sky, broadcasting from the traditional territories of the Dene, Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis.
For some evacuees, they're breathing a little sigh of relief, able to start the journey back to their homes in Pelican Narrows and Sandy Bay. Last night, Highway 106 from Smeaton up to Highway 135 was reopened. They did ask some people to stay away a little longer yet, elders, home care clients, young children, and those with health concerns. But for more than 30 communities, they're still evacuated and wondering about the loss. We know from the Public Safety Agency updates that at least 260 values have been lost. Those could be homes, vehicles, cabins, businesses. But we've also been told that number will likely exceed 400. Today, we're going to look at the conditions, fire loss, prevention, and rebuilding. We're also going to get an update from our national reporter who spent a significant amount of time touring the north and chat with a research institute funded by the insurance industry that's working to make Canadians safer against severe weather. Of course, we also want to hear from you. If you've ever been affected by the fires, if you've had to rebuild due to a fire, or if you live in a forested area, if you've made changes to your building to make it more fire resistant. Call 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, as I mentioned, our national reporter, Alexander Silberman, has just returned from a tour of northern Saskatchewan. He visited many communities touched by fire, and he's back and in Regina studio with me. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Sam.
Tell me, what was it like going up there, and how long did you actually spend in northern Saskatchewan?
Well, I spent close to 2 weeks across the north trying to crisscross the region and get to as many communities as possible because the reality on the ground was very different depending on where you were. We started off in Candle Lake, which is one of the first communities to really come to the forefront for fire risk with the shoe fire, later merging into the campfire, burning very close to it. And there was active work on the ground to build a fire break. There were a lot of firefighters out and about in the community. And it was pretty quiet because with that pre-evacuation order, a lot of people were just packing up, leaving, and not taking any chances. But of course, it is a seasonal community for the most part. You see that population swell to upwards of 10, 11,000 residents. And a lot of people don't live there year round. So definitely a lot of concerns on the ground for possible risk to property, but those concerns are quite heightened when you go to communities where it's people's year-round home and they don't have another property. So I also spent a lot of time in the Montreal Lake area as well. This is a community that knows wildfire and the risks just all too well. You might recall back in 2015, they were forced to leave for I think about a month, and there were quite a few homes in that community that were damaged by fire. So people there were welcoming in evacuees from some communities further north. They took people in from Weyakquin. They have staff housing there for people who come to work from outside the community, where they're able to accommodate some of the evacuees. And they were also setting up cots in their gym to be able to take in upwards of 100 people from Weyakquin and from L'Orange as well after that community was evacuated.
What was the roughest part for you when it came to being close to the fires? I know that there's a lot of highway closures up there. You're also being cognizant of emergency crews trying to get in and out, highway closures. What in terms of fire did you encounter?
Well, the challenge as a reporter is it was so difficult to reach a lot of the communities that had the biggest impact from fires. By the time fire hit Denair Beach, it was cut off from a significant distance. You couldn't get anywhere close because the highway was cut off about an hour or so north of Prince Albert. Same thing for Pelican Narrows. So for people from those communities, we could only hear their stories when speaking to them at evacuation centers in Prince Albert. But when it comes to just the conditions on the ground, being out there reporting, the toughest would have been right along Highway 2 in the Weyakquin area, where the ditch fire, which burned through there, burned right around the community and moved north. But when we went through and visited, it was still very much an active fire. You had helicopters flying overhead. The highway that we drove along was briefly closed at times because they were doing backburns to try and eliminate that fuel. So you had helicopters dropping flames and lighting areas on fire right along this highway, which was still open, and they were lighting parts of it on fire. There were a couple of moments where we were on the side of the road and I was about to shoot an on-cam, and then you could just hear the crackling of the flames as a wind gust was pushing fire through the brush and close to us on the highway, and we had to get into the car and drive away to get to a safe place.
a little harrowing, but important for us to be able to tell these stories and to be up there and to see what's really happening. When you go to these communities, did you see any of the damage, or were you able to get into the communities that were damaged?
We didn't see much damage to property. We were able to get into Weyakwan right after the evacuation order was lifted by the hamlet's mayor, and you could see substantial damage to the forest around the community. It was pretty striking just how close the fire got. There was basically like a black line of where the fire had burned right up to the edge of a residential street. And in the village itself, it was green. There was a lot of trees, and it was still very much full of life and wildlife. But as soon as you stepped beyond the periphery of the village, it was just burnt out forest, completely charred. No sign of life. You couldn't hear any birds or anything. So a lot of the residents were saying it was pretty sad to come back. They were happy to see that their homes were still standing, but the forest around them, which is so important to people in that area for hunting and gathering and just way of life, is completely gone and will take many years to grow back.
You have talked to crews that have been fighting these fires, the heroes that are keeping these structures safe. You spoke with a firefighter in Sucker River. Tell us about Joe Rat.
That's right. It seemed like there was a firefighter around every corner. When we were up in Weyakwan, we saw lots of firefighters just out and about, putting out hot spots, doing some of the cleanup work. And Prince Albert, too, I saw a lot of firefighters as well, coming down from the north because they just desperately needed a break. One of those was Joe Rat. I met him in the parking lot of the Prince Albert Grand Council Urban Services building, and he was stepping out of a car that was covered in soot and ash, and it had clearly driven through like the most hazardous fire conditions possible because it was gray from the ash. The window was smashed in from brush that he drove through. No. Unbelievable what this car went through to still be standing. And Joe Rat is a volunteer firefighter from Sucker River, which is a community about 30 kilometers north of Larange, where there was significant damage from the fires. He had just gotten into Prince Albert at, I think, 3 or 4 in the morning, desperately needed a break after not getting any sleep for days on end. And he described to me what the conditions were like on the ground. Have a listen.
We couldn't go near the fire. We had to pretty much stand and watch because we had propane tanks, gas tanks, heavy equipment all around, and they were all engulfed. So all we could do is watch instead of putting people in harm's way.
So the conditions were so dangerous that you couldn't do anything at one point?
Exactly, yeah. The fires create their own storm, so you kind of feel helpless because you have your senior leaders that are telling you to back off and you want to go fight it, but it's just a helpless situation.
Must be a difficult call to make.
Yeah, it is, especially when you see the houses burning down. Because I'm a wildland firefighter and a structural firefighter, so it's a hard pill to swallow when you see those homes burning down, especially if they're a family. It's one of the most destructive fires I have ever seen in my life. My heart goes out to the families. They lost everything. All their memories are gone, and what are they going to do now? They're not going to get their homes built right off the bat because there's still so much fire out there. So they're going to feel homeless and lost.
What does Sucker River look like now?
It looks like a war zone. This is what you see. Buildings going up in flames like this.
You can hear the helplessness in his voice.
You really can. And Joe Rat was telling me it was really the worst case scenario for him as a firefighter. You heard him say the conditions were so bad that he had to stand back with his crew and watch the homes of family members, friends burn to the ground without being able to do anything. He told me him and his team of volunteer firefighters had just one fire truck that they could use, so they were very limited as far as resources. His own home was still standing when I spoke with him, but he did tell me that his sister's house and his brother-in-law's homes were among those that were destroyed.
Oh, that's got to be hard to watch. We know that people have been out of their homes for a while now, living in hotel rooms, evacuation centers. You've met with so many of these people, some of which who weren't able to get into those centers. Are there any stories that stick with you?
Yeah, well, it's tough for so many, especially I think of all the families that are packed into hotel rooms. We heard like the manager at the Days Inn in Prince Albert, where many of the evacuees from L'Orange are, describing how packed people are there. There's air mattresses and cots in the rooms, and he was saying it's on average like 5 to 6 people in a room. And these are pretty small hotel rooms. So it's
meant for two people.
meant for a couple of people, but you have a whole family packed in there for not knowing how long they're going to be in that situation. And tired kids who want attention and activities. So it's tough for many. One story that really stuck with me was a family that I met in the parking lot of this evacuation center in Prince Albert. They weren't able to find a hotel room, and they didn't really want to stay in a mass shelter, which is understandable for many people, sleeping on a cot in a big gym with hundreds of other people. So they were sleeping in their SUV, and they described to me what it was like just driving out in these conditions. You had people on the side of the highway who didn't have a ride, trying to walk out of L'Orange, looking for someone to pick them up. And so they picked up random people that they saw on the side of the road, either that they knew or that they just knew were from L'Orange and needed help. They grabbed some dogs as well from neighbors. And so they had, I think, something like 7 or 8 dogs in the car with them.
No.
A bunch of people that they picked up on the side of the road, fellow community members. It was an absolute packed car. I think they had, 7 people in there, a bunch of dogs. It was chaos from the fires. It was chaos from the people that they were helping to evacuate. And then when they got to L'Orange, they've been sleeping in their SUV in this parking lot since then, not knowing when they might be able to go back, and also watching the damage in the community from afar too. They were telling me that when they saw the videos of Robertson's and the hardware store burning, that they cried because this is their home, and it was devastating for them to see that part of their home was lost.
Those are it's comparable to like landmarks in any major city for them, right? Those were pillars of their community and familiar spaces that they knew and could identify as their own. Who decides when it's safe and people get to go back?
So it's my understanding, Sam, that it's at the end of the day, it's up to local officials to make the call, both for issuing an evacuation order, the final call on that, and also lifting the evacuation order. So the SPSA is very much involved in looking at the conditions on the ground, briefing local officials, and offering recommendations based on proximity of fire to the community, what the weather conditions look like, what the risk is of a flare-up. At the end of the day, though, that call is with local officials. And in some cases, there is some growing pressure. People are really tired of being in these conditions as evacuees, right?
8 people in one room kind of thing.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly. Or if you're sleeping on a cot in a gym in Prince Albert, right? I mean, a lot of these people are really eager to get back home and also see what their properties look like. So I spoke with the mayor of Weyakwen, Med Thomas, and he was telling me a lot of people were pressuring him to lift that evacuation order as soon as things improved a little bit. It seemed like he was a bit hesitant, and he was telling me his message to the community is, well, think carefully if it's the right time to go back. There's still very thick smoke in that area. The air quality is very bad. I had to wear an N95 mask the whole time. Without the mask on, I'd start coughing after breathing in the air for just a couple of minutes. And there's still small flare-ups of fire with hot spots in the woods around it. So he was saying the evacuation order was lifted. People can go back if they'd like to, but really think carefully about that if now is the right time, especially for residents that are a bit more vulnerable or have health issues. We're seeing in the case of Pelican Narrows as well, they're letting some people back in, but encouraging elders, people with any sort of respiratory health issue to wait a little bit longer until things improve.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should type situation?
Exactly. And a lot of people, too, are worried that they might go back and then have to evacuate again as well. I
can't even imagine the roller coaster of that, thinking, okay, we're safe to go back, and then like a week later going through this all over again.
I know, and we're only early June, right? Which is tough to consider.
What are you going to be watching over the next couple of days?
Well, a couple of things. I'll definitely be watching for the weather to see if that manages to keep fires at bay. We got a bit of rain, which was very good to see. It was raining on my drive back here, which was wonderful to see after those tough conditions and hearing how challenging that was for crews. But I did hear from fire crews on the ground that what they really need is several days of a good heavy downpour to really douse those flames and put things out. So we'll see if that rain is enough of a help and if those conditions will improve. We'll also, in thinking more long term, we'll have to see how long it takes to rebuild in some of these areas that did lose homes and what that looks like in different areas, because we've seen elsewhere in the country, in certain communities, sometimes it can take years to rebuild, whereas in other areas it can be fairly quick, depending on what sort of support there is from the government and who's prioritized. So that's also something I'll be watching for.
Well, and you just think of how difficult it is right now in terms of resources and trades in major cities in Saskatchewan, and now take that up north where you need resources and trades to get those things going. It's going to be a difficult journey for a lot of these people. Alex, thanks so much for your reporting and for spending some time with the show and us today.
Thank you.
That's CBC national reporter Alexander Silberman. You can read more of his work at cbc.ca/sask or cbc.ca/light if you are looking at our Light website, for lack of better words, LITE. It uses less data if that's something that you're struggling with. I want to bring in our next guest now. Obviously, as fires continue to devastate the north, there are some people returning to communities to see if there is damage. To find out more about what they're dealing with and what's next, we've reached Glenn McGillivray. He's the managing director for the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction. They are a research institute that's funded by the insurance industry and are working to make Canadians safer when it comes to severe weather. Welcome to Blue Sky, Glenn.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Listening to Alexander talk about his 2 weeks in the north, what stood out to you?
Well, it keeps rolling through my head that we can't forget that these events are about the people, right? The people that are affected by these, whether it's losing their properties, being evacuated, losing the forested area around their home, an area that won't be the same for perhaps ever. It's just about the people, and we can never forget that's kind of the bottom line of this.
What are some of the challenges that local communities face in trying to fight these fires?
Yeah, fighting these fires is almost an oxymoron. It's almost impossible to suppress these types of fires. They are so intense. I was thinking about Jasper last year, and what the firefighters were saying is the only thing they could do is get out of the way, and that's kind of what we're seeing today. And that wildland firefighter that was interviewed a few minutes ago was saying, I've been doing this for X number of decades, and I've never seen fire behavior like this. And this is what we're hearing time and time and time again. It's not just the number of fires. It's not just the size of fires. It's the fire behavior, to the point where they're creating their own storm systems, sometimes their own fire-type tornadoes. And small communities at the forefront of this. There's something like 60,000 small communities across the country that have similar exposure, and they don't have the resources to deal with these things.
Glenn, how did fire used to behave? Can you give us a sense of how things have changed?
Yeah, one of the biggies that I talk about a lot is, back in the day, quote unquote, whenever you choose to call it that. Mm-hmm. Fire would settle down in the overnight period. We'd get the dampness rolling in the overnight. The winds would die down. Things would cool off, and it gave crews a chance to take a breather. It gave air crews that rest that they need because they couldn't fight fire in the nighttime. And then things would ramp back up again mid to late next morning, and they can get back at it again. And that's not happening as much anymore. We're starting to see fire behavior in the overnight period that's just as bad as during the day. And this puts the crews at immense stress because, of course, we don't have double the crews to do this work. And the human resources implications of this are absolutely huge. Our system is already being stretched to the limit. And if you can imagine now that we have to fight fire as vigorously in the overnight as we did during the day, just the fallout from that is huge. And to the point where Alberta started to fight fires in the overnight, like air attack, launching air attack in the overnight. That never used to be the case. And I think Alberta is only the second or third place in the world to do this using night vision goggles. It's out of necessity. And this is one of the big changes that we're seeing. Extreme fire behavior that's just not settling down.
I had no idea that they were using night vision to attack them in the evening. Is it more effective to fight a fire in the evening because it's cooler? Do they find that makes a difference?
I think it makes a bit of a difference, but the idea is that the fires are just so intense as they can't let up.
They just can't stop.
They will lose ground. So.
Okay, Glenn, I want to just take a pause here for a moment. I need to check in with our newsroom. David Shield is standing by with a quick look at headlines that our newsroom is working on this hour. Hi, David.
Hi, Sam. Well, many evacuees from Pelican Narrows will be allowed to return home. The road from Smeaton to Pelican Narrows is now considered safe for travel, and weather conditions have improved. However, children under 5, pregnant women, elders, and people with respiratory conditions are asked to not come back yet. A new permanent CEO has been announced for real. Rick Bennett will now head up the Regina Exhibition Association Limited. Bennett has worked as a management consultant and will now be in charge of operating the Brand Centre, the Cooperator Centre, and staging events in the city. And a lawsuit against Legacy Christian Academy and Mile 2 Church in Saskatoon has been thrown out. Former students at the school alleged that they were abused at the school and the church. The judge said settlement agreements were reached with some of the staff, but other staff were not notified until months after. And I'll have a full newscast for you coming up at 1 o'clock.
Thanks so much for that, David.
You're welcome.
That's the CBC's David Shield. Today we're talking about forest fires, wildfires, fires in general, as we continue to face a wildfire state of emergency here in Saskatchewan. And we're talking with Glenn McGillivray. Glenn is the managing director for the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is a research institute funded by the insurance industry, working to make Canadians safer against severe weather. Glenn, as we are talking about this, you talked about how this is all about the people, and I want to hear from some personal experiences. If you have thoughts on today's topic, you can call 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca if you're someone who has experience with this and has maybe changed your building practices to make things more fire resistant in your region. But a cabin owner in East Trout Lake shared his firsthand look at the fire devastation. The entire village was destroyed by wildfire, including Nathan Pitka's 5 family cabins, and Pitka says he had to go and see the damage for himself.
The road going in was quite haunting. As we passed Candle Lake, we saw emergency crews starting to prepare for the fire that had been approaching Candle Lake. Past that, we turned onto Highway 927, the final 27-kilometer stretch into our town site. What we saw was haunting, very devastating. There was areas of scorched forest, areas that were completely burnt down to the ground. The sky was dark with smoke. There were still fires smoldering in the ditches, and it was quite horrific to see when we got into the town site itself. We were at loss of words to what we saw. The entire community had been devastated. There wasn't a single structure standing in the community that we had been going to for 48 years and held a very special place in our heart. It was absolutely devastating. There was nothing left in the town site. Every structure had burned to the ground. There was a pile of metal and concrete, and there were still hot spots. It was quite. We were very careful because a lot of the septic tanks had burned right down to the ground, and there were holes that we didn't want to fall into. There was obviously we were wearing ventilators where we could, because the smell was quite bad, and the smoke was, as I mentioned, still smoldering and burning across the lake at the time we were there. We took photos. We went around the community and took pictures of everybody's lot to make sure that they had images, because we didn't think others should be going up there at this time after what we had experienced. And then we provided those to the community members. I mean, certainly we're still grieving about the overall loss. At this point, I'm wanting to support however I can to make sure that this gets the attention We haven't had a response from the government. The community is in grief and uncertain as to what the path to recovery looks like. And so we're really looking to get some support and some answers so we can start moving ahead.
Glenn, how common is his experience? People needing to see what happened and going in while it is still, a little bit dangerous to make maybe a decision about their future and to have that reality check of what they're facing.
Yeah, very common, of course. It's just a human condition, human nature to have closure, want to have closure and get the answers and to be able to move on a little bit. Unfortunately, sometimes, people are not allowed back in. We saw that in Fort McMurray where dangerous situation. And so we do advise that people only re-enter the community when.
Okay. Oh, we're just having, he's just, Glenn, are you still there? Can you still hear me?
I'm still here.
Okay. You've just been freezing up a little bit. Yeah. You said we saw that with Fort McMurray and then we missed pretty much everything you said after that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. You faded off as well.
Okay. We're going to reconnect with Glenn by phone just to make this a little easier, but we're going to move to some tape here now because speaking of seeing things firsthand, Scott Robertson is one of the owners of the family-run Robertson Trading Post. I know a lot of you have been wondering how the family is doing. It was a staple in La Ronge for 56 years before it closed in 2023. And we all saw the video of the building being destroyed, absolutely devoured by fire last week. And with it went hundreds of priceless Indigenous artifacts. Scott had stayed in the area to try and save his family's cottage. And Jeffrey Tram spoke with him earlier today. Here's some of that conversation.
I don't know how I feel. I feel everything. I feel anger. I feel sadness. I feel frustration. I feel regret. I mean, you feel it all. How would anybody feel? My family has had that business for almost 6 decades. Robertson Trading was a real live trading post. An Indigenous mother could send her daughter to the store with a marten skin or two and come home with a bag of groceries. We would still buy and sell raw animal skins that we bought from the Indigenous community. We would also buy and sell beadwork, moose hides, moose hide jackets, birch bark bindings, birch bark baskets. It was a real live trading post. Having worked for the Hudson's Bay Company for almost a quarter of a century, my father cycled through all over Western Canada and developed a love for both Indigenous people and Indigenous art, culture, beadwork, all that kind of stuff. To the point where, we buried my father in a pair of moose hide moccasins. I don't know about the future. This much I'm pretty sure of. I'm 67 now. I don't have the time left to rebuild Robertson Trading. The fact that artwork is gone is really a loss, not just for me and my family, but for the community. We hoarded that stuff for decades. We would sell, the poor quality stuff and the mediocre stuff, and sometimes even some very nice stuff. But the best of the best, we kept and hoarded because I always had this dream that one day we would have some kind of a museum/art gallery in La Ronge, and we would have a first-class display of Aboriginal, Indigenous beadwork and artwork. The history of Northern Saskatchewan is really interesting. The interaction between Indigenous peoples and the fur traders, the Hudson's Bay Company. La Ronge should have a first-class museum. And now one of those displays has gone up in smoke, and I don't think it's replaceable. The store is a total loss. I mean, it burned like a tiger torch for 5 hours. I've walked around the perimeter. There's not even a piece of wood showing. It is just a fireball. How that could have burned so hot, I don't know. But ironically, that's not the only problem we have. I mean, my brother spent a whole day and that night fighting a fire to save my family cottage. A heroic effort on his part. Had he not been there, we would have lost that too. And then ironically, just because the fire passed us by doesn't mean that we're safe yet, because there are spot fires popping up all over the place every day since I've been back in La Ronge. we have been fighting spot fires out on the lake. Not only at our cabin, we tried to save another guy's cabin the other day. We were just a half hour too late, I think, for saving that cabin. It went up in a ball of flame. We spent yesterday putting out spot fires at my cabin and putting sprinkler systems up at a friend's cabin. So every day we have been out doing something.
Part of what we've been doing, we've been trying to cover is the fact that, just kind of like what kind of supports communities are getting during a time like this. Could this have been more preventable, like the outcome of what happened in terms of preventive measures, resources, that type of stuff?
I think the authorities are doing a good job. If you look at the video of Robertson's burning, there are a dozen fire trucks there. There were 2 young guys front and center with a hose on Robertson's. I watched those guys get hit with a sheet of steel that got blown off when the helicopters were dumping. There's a big helicopter that dumps 1,000 gallons at a time. It seemed to make no difference. I don't know why those fires burn so hot, but they do. These young guys were working their butts off trying to save that place. I have no criticism there. My only criticism of the authorities is this. There is nobody fighting fires out on the lake. The fact that a family cottage is not in a community or in a town doesn't mean it's not important. People pass cabins on from grandfathers to grandchild, and the only people that are out there fighting cottage fires are locals who ironically have to hide from the authorities. If they get caught in town, they're going to get kicked out of town, even though they are able-bodied, motivated, sometimes very well-supplied individuals. My brother and I'm 67, he's 69. We're putting up a sprinkler system at a cabin yesterday. 3 young guys show up with a boat full of material and put up a first-class sprinkler system. We helped them all afternoon. And the talk was, if they get discovered, the authorities are going to kick them out of town. It is ridiculous that the authorities are kicking able-bodied young men out of town who are prepared to put in the effort and their own money to save other people's property. Someone should call Scott Moe.
That was Scott Robertson speaking with the CBC's Jeffrey Tram. Scott Robertson, one of the owners of the family-run Robertson Trading Post that did burn down last week as that fire got into town. Glenn, as you're listening to him, you hear the passion about him wanting to stay behind. When it comes to insurance, how is that all connected?
Yeah, I don't think I would try to connect in an insurance discussion here. I don't think it's relevant. But I have seen many times where people have decided to stay back in order to protect their property, and afterwards said, "I would never do that again." It's not just a matter of making that decision. It's having the training, knowing what to expect, having the equipment, having a plan, being able to get out if need be. All sorts of things. Just probably a few short years ago, 5 or not even so years ago, people started talking about this idea of stand and defend or stay and defend. It's a big discussion in Australia as well. Stay behind and protect your property. And again, these people quite often would come out of it and say, I would never do that again. It wasn't the brightest decision in the world, because once that firestorm settles into that area, it's staggering. We've got some video and some footage of the Ember Storm in Fort McMurray. You would swear it was 3 o'clock in the morning, but it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You couldn't see the sun. The embers were like billions of lit cigarettes being dropped down on the community. Spot fires happening all over the place. Smoke, heat. A lot of this footage we've seen out of places like California, a very similar situation. So it's not just a matter of saying, "Yeah, I'm gonna stay." You really need to know what you're doing. And we really don't advise that the average person make that decision unless they have some training behind them and some equipment and planning.
I do want to talk to you a little bit about insurance, though, because some of these people will have no insurance. I've seen some GoFundMes pop up already for people who didn't have insurance on their properties. What does this do to insurance rates? I remember what happened after Slave Lake and Fort McMurray.
Yeah, that's not for me to say. We have a large number of insurance companies operating in Canada, and what they decide to do after an event is up to them, and how that event impacts their individual books of business and that sort of thing. So not really for me to say, other than to say that we are not seeing the kind of crises that they're seeing in places like California and Florida. Insurance is still very easy to get in Canada. Not necessarily cheap, I didn't say that, but it's fairly easy to obtain. We're not seeing the type of insurance crisis that we're seeing in places like California.
Okay, let's talk about the ability to rebuild. Your work really focuses on making communities and homes more resilient to things like wildfires. And as people began to think about rebuilding, maybe in somewhere like East Trout Lake, what should they be thinking about in terms of prevention from a similar event in the future?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things that center around the idea of flammability. So first off is what the structure is made of, the construction materials used to build. And the second thing is what's immediately around the property that can ignite and burn the structure down. So most structures are lost in wildfires due to ember ignition. They're not usually lost due to direct impact with the forest fire itself. It's usually those embers that are blown far ahead of the fire front that will ignite something on the property, something very close to the structure, and A leads to B, which leads to C, the ignition of the structure and the loss of the structure. We know how to build a home that's more resilient against wildfire. We know what kind of building materials are necessary. And we also know what should and shouldn't be immediately around the home. And that 1.5 meters around the property is so important. It's incredibly important. We've seen many, many, many homes survive really intense firestorms simply because there was nothing flammable immediately around the home. So we know how to do this. It's not a mystery. The science is very clear. We have to get on with making our at-risk communities more resilient to wildfire.
What are some of those materials that you said are better for building with?
Yeah, so first of all, the roof cover, the shingles or whatever you have on the roof should be a Class A, should rate a Class A. A lot of people think you should have or must have a metal roof. That's not necessarily the case. You can have an asphalt shingle roof or you can have some other material as long as it's got that Class A rating on it. And the good news is that most roof covers have a Class A rating. And often when people have their home re-roofed after, 15 or 20 years, most often than not, the shingles will have a Class A rating. So we're kind of solving that problem already. What you don't want to have is wood shakes, cedar shakes, and particularly untreated cedar shakes. This was a huge problem in Jasper. They're very quaint and they're very nice and they're beautiful in a place like Jasper or Banff, but they're super, super flammable. So roof cover is really, really key. And secondly, we talk about the siding, the cladding on the house, and just vinyl siding is an absolute no-go. We don't want to see vinyl siding in a community that's at risk of wildfire. Vinyl siding melts. It melts at only 80 degrees Celsius, and it will expose the rest of the home to fire. Just not a good idea at all. We would suggest something like a cement fiberboard siding, a stucco siding, various types of stone or brick. There's a number of things that you can use, but just anything is better than vinyl. And then we can talk about things like the decking around the house. We really would like to see something like a patio, a cement patio, or use of pavers, stone, that sort of thing. We really don't like to see a wood deck in at-risk communities, particularly if they're raised and embers can get underneath the decking and ignite things like leaf debris, and other things like that. Super, super flammable. And then you start getting into things like wood fencing. We don't want to see a wood fence attached to the home. It just basically conveys fire right to the structure. Venting, any type of venting, in say the attic venting, for example, you want the grid in that venting to be so small that embers can't get in it. There's a whole host of things, and if you go to Fire Smart Canada, you'll find all this information. FireSmart is like the premier wildfire protection program in the country. It's the way to go.
We know that wildfire recovery takes a long time, both in the environment and when it comes to infrastructure. Little Red River Cree Nation in northern Alberta lost hundreds of homes to a wildfire 2 years ago, and CBC News went up there to check on the rebuilding process recently. Liam Harrop has some details on how the recovery has gone, and it has been slow. Let's have a listen.
Sometimes we had to drive on a ditch just to avoid the trees.
That's Chief Conroy Siwapegaham of Little Red River Cree Nation, going down the same road he drove in May of 2023 to rescue firefighters when a wildfire destroyed hundreds of homes in his community of Fox Lake. Now the community is rebuilding, but it's challenging.
It was much easier to evacuate all our members than it was for the recovery side.
Access is hard because construction materials are sent by air or down a deeply rutted dirt road with a barge crossing. So far, 41 families have new homes, all with metal roofs and metal window blinds. Fire guards hundreds of kilometers long have been cut, and there are plans to build fire hydrants, something they didn't have before. Money comes from the federal government under the Emergency Management Assistance Program to help First Nations after disasters.
There's still so many displaced families that are awaiting to move into their new homes that haven't been built yet.
That's Veronica Nanuch, head of disaster recovery for the nation. She says 100 families still need housing, living in trailers and hotels while they wait.
A lot of them are just waiting for their forever home to be rebuilt and come back home and create new memories.
The nation expects the rebuild to take another 4 years. Liam Harrop, CBC News, Edmonton.
Glenn, is there a responsibility on the individual or the community when it comes to planning more resilient to fire neighborhoods and homes? Who do you think has the bigger onus?
Yeah, we often talk about the quote-unquote all of society approach where everybody has to get involved. I'll tell you where it's important. You can apply FireSmart principles to your home and your property, but if your neighbor is very close by and doesn't, you might be at equal risk anyway. It's really important, I think, that communities buy in to FireSmarting the community and do whatever they can to make that community less flammable. It's the same principle when you're looking at a community or whether you're looking at an individual property. It's just absolutely so important. You get that ember rain into the community. It causes spot fires all over the place. Again, if there's really nothing flammable in that community, and we've seen it. We've seen places that have are really well prepared for these types of things. The fire just won't become an urban conflagration and burn every place down. So it's really important, I think, that community members cooperate, work together, work with the local government, work with the provinces. Everybody has a role to play in making communities more resilient.
Okay. I want to go to the phones. Scott Robertson, who spoke with Jeffrey Tram a little earlier, has been listening to the show and is on the line. Hi, Scott.
Hi there.
Thank you for listening. And first of all, I'm so sorry to hear about what happened to your family space. I know it was such an important space and such a great collection, but I know more than anything, it was your family's and your family's memories. And so for that, I'm really sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
You called for a specific reason. What would you like to share with us?
I just happened to be driving south. I have to talk to a banker today and some insurance people. And I heard Glenn talking about how he doesn't recommend that people should stay and protect properties. I disagree strongly with that. The people that I have encountered who are staying behind are strong, strong-willed, resilient people with resources and exit plans, and they have made a difference. But ironically, they are saving the insurance companies hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and they are completely unrewarded. So I disagree.
Scott, what are you hearing from insurance people at this point?
Well, I haven't. And to be honest, I don't want to play that out in public. But I think there is a role for people who are motivated and well outfitted to stay behind and save their communities.
Okay, that's and are there still a number of people in La Ronge? Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the experience up there? I can't imagine that it was great.
There are people still out there trying to save cottages. And, a cottage can be as important to a family and a family's history as the house they live in. And because the authorities are not out there on the lake trying to save people's cottages, I think there is a role for these individuals, these vigilante firefighters. And perhaps the insurance people and the government has liability issues that they would like to prevent by not letting people out there. I say people should be allowed to play a role in this if they are so motivated. One other thing I wanted to mention, walking around the destruction of Robertson Trading, the only material that seems to have stood up was a product called Dual Block, which was one of the construction materials used in a previous renovation of ours. And some of it looks like it's essentially brand new. I'm wondering if there isn't a bigger role for that product in construction.
What is it? What is it made of?
It's a big, bulky, essentially it's like a concrete block, but it's made out of sawdust and cement.
Oh. Well, that's...
So my question for Glenn is he familiar with the product, and is there a bigger role for that? It's virtually the only thing still standing in our wreckage.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the product. All I can say is that, we can do a fairly good job with the building products that are normally used in construction. It all comes down to preventing that initial ignition from happening in the first place. Homes don't just go up in smoke. Something around them or on them ignites first and kind of creates that chain reaction. And that's what generally happens. And we've done 4 major forensic investigations after fires in Canada. And what we do is we look at homes that survived right next to homes that didn't survive. And the homes that survived aren't built with anything special. It's just that there was nothing around that ignited and caused that chain reaction. So that's the key here. Maybe that product is something to look at. I really don't know. But we really advocate for, and we have strong evidence for Class A roofing and anything but vinyl on the side of that home and anything else that can't ignite immediately around the property.
Thanks for that, Glenn. Scott, were you...
Our store was completely clad in heavy steel, completely.
Scott, were you able to save the family cabin?
Yes, thanks to my brother. And like I say, so the rule for he and I is to go out there every day and fight these spot fires that are just relentless. I mean, we pour thousands of gallons of water into the bush around that cabin and come back the next day and find another spot fire. Some of them can be quite large, and depending on the wind direction, you could have this firestorm pass your cabin by. You could save it, like we did, and have it burned up because of a garbage can-sized spot fire the following day.
Are you ever worried you're going to get trapped?
I haven't been. I grew up in the north. I have a boat. I have a cabin. I have an exit plan. And anybody in their right mind facing flames like this has got to have an exit plan first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to tell us about, Scott, before we let you go?
No, I just thought I should add my 2 bits for those poor buggers that are out there trying to save other people's property.
No, I appreciate that so much. And I mean, it's not your first rodeo. I know you've been through this before. Thank you so much for thinking of us and calling in.
Thank you.
That's Scott Robertson, one of the owners of Robertson Trading Post. And our guest over the last hour has been Glenn McGillivray. He is the managing director for the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction. The big message from him, fire smart your property in order to avoid this. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us. Coming up tomorrow, it's been a rough spring for electric vehicles in Canada. Demand is down.